I want to start with questionings. Mr. Yonkers, you talked about 2016 and your goal to achieve a 50% of domestic aviation fuel requirement, and then you alluded to maybe you could do it even sooner, or that might be rosier than even that projection. Can you talk about what are the milestones to getting to 2016, what you think those challenges are, how you might see us proceeding to achieve that goal?
Well, Senator Thune talked about the initial Fisher-Trope certification, and we're 99% of the way there. There are two platforms that we're still looking to complete that final touch on the Fisher-Trope alternative synthetic fuel approach, and that's Global Hawk and Reaper, the remotely piloted aircraft. When we turn over and look at the HRJ, we're going to be completed with that certification program probably by the end of 13. Then, as we look down the road at the next pathway, the alcohol to jet, probably the 2014-2015 timeframe. So essentially what I think we're on a glide path to achieve here is a full certification for all three pathways by the year 2014 and 15. As we go down this road, we learn, we get better at what we do. We have a Pathfinder approach so that we're not going and recertifying or certifying every aircraft platform, that we can, by extension and extrapolation, look at the family of particular biofuels or synthetic fuels and arrive at the same conclusion, because if they fly on one aircraft without problems, they can fly on another.
And what is the mix? You know, obviously we hear about synthetic fuels. How green are these synthetic fuels that you're talking about?
Well, there's certainly a drawback with the synthetic fuels in particular, whether it's coal-derived or whether it comes from natural gas, and in some cases coal. I think our results are showing that from a greenhouse gas point of view, it's probably twice of what conventional fuel is. The biofuels, as you've heard from some of the members on the panel today, are upwards to 80% better. Our results show that 60 to 70%, so pretty close parity with what we're seeing out of the private sector.
Ms. Pinkerton, could you talk about the EU and how important it is that we move forward on a green source of synthetic fuel, or how is the airline industry looking at this from a commercial side?
Well, let me address your question about the EU. As I think most of you know, the EU is proposing a unilateral cap-and-trade system on U.S. airlines, starting in U.S. airspace. They are proposing to move forward with this. They've already started collecting data. There was a hearing yesterday on the House side in which the administration thankfully testified in opposition to that unilateral approach. But I have to say, alternative fuels are absolutely a critical element of the airline's ability to meet their global commitments through ICAO. We've committed to 1.5% fuel efficiency improvements, to carbon neutral growth starting in 2020, and we can't get there by ourselves. We're going to need to implement next-gen, but even with next-gen, alternative fuels are clearly a critical part of our ability to meet our international goals.
What happens if the EU continues to act unilaterally?
Well, I think there are a variety of options. Legislation has been introduced in the House side. It was introduced last week, bipartisan legislation to essentially prohibit U.S. airlines from participating in the EU ETS scheme. But that being said, the administration has taken the lead to sit down with the Europeans. They did so in June of this year, and essentially laid out the U.S. government's position. And by the way, we don't stand alone. Latin America, the Chinese, essentially the rest of the world is with us in opposing the EU scheme. We're hopeful that through these diplomatic channels, we're going to be able to convince the Europeans to stand down, to work with us in ICAO on achieving a global framework to address climate change, since climate change is a global issue. But it's unclear. There's potential for litigation in the UN process. That's certainly one option, but we hope it doesn't come to that.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Mr. Plaza, and I thank all the panelists for their testimony. I'm going to start with a question in general about the feedstock. We've heard from the first panel, and obviously Ms. Canales about what USDA is doing. Can you comment on the variety of feedstocks that could be used in this? Obviously, there's a lot going on in the Pacific Northwest, but there's opportunity all across the country for this product, I guess, from the input to produce uniform output, I guess is the best way to say it. Is that correct? And could you comment on what those opportunities are?
Senator, thank you. And I can speak to some of the feedstocks that are USDA is currently looking at. And these are, again, not the complete inclusive list, but oil seeds, Midwest and Great Plains and Pacific Northwest, poplar and pine found in the American Southeast, sorghum found in Texas, Oklahoma, and the lower Midwest, sugarcane found in Florida Southeast, switchgrass, Midwest and Southeast. Soon to be announced will be others pertaining to Douglas fir, alder, hemlock, and eucalyptus, perennial and prairie grasses other than switchgrass, and then, of course, algae.
And so are these in the end product a interchangeable source, or are we talking about picking winners and losers here?
Those are all prospects. Those are all opportunities for feedstock. So they're not. This is not in any type of order of priority.
So, from Imperium's perspective, the technology that's ready for scale and commercialization now is using lipids such as existing oilseed crops, future oilseed crops like algae and camelina. We specifically have invested, as you heard from Secretary Yonkers, in the technology development of converting alcohols into jet fuel, and have partnered with Pacific Northwest National Labs in the Tri-Cities to develop a technology that will allow us to use feedstocks like municipal solid waste and wood residue. Just using Seattle as an example, we produce enough trash every day to make 200 million gallons of jet fuel if our technologies can scale. So the importance of I think this industry can be not dependent on any one feedstock or any one technology, but dependent on the finished product. It's important that the end result be approval of these products and acceptance of these products and long-term policies that support the multiple pathways. And we actually believe longer term, with, as Secretary Yonkers mentioned, that alcohol to jet fuel is a better pathway in the long run than lipids.
Mr. Altman, did you want to comment on that?
Yes, all of these feedstocks are applicable, and from a CAFE point of view, we are neutral to process. From a certification point of view, you want to put some of these together in processes. So camelina, algae, or hydrotreated renewable jet has been explained to you. Alcohol's process can come from anything from woods to giant miscanthus, which is prominent in the Southeast. And it's really a matter of what grows locally and what can be harvested and produced economically. And from our point of view, we're qualifying all of them. And as Mr. Yonkers and others have identified, we should have a full family through alcohol to jet, through synthetic biology, using sugars, and through pyrolysis oil, I would expect by 2015.
And so that is what your fuel readiness level is, and is identifying as an industry what fuels are at that level?
Yes. What fuel readiness level does is it uses the accepted Defense Department gated risk management approach to manage how we bring along technology from the various earliest research phase through certification and then through production. And this is something that's been globally accepted by ICAO, and we use this to track process. And we also have with USDA a variation of that called feedstock readiness. So we've taken aerospace techniques for gated risk management and are applying that with the research centers of USDA to mature feedstocks on a similar scale and to communicate their status as we do with the fuels themselves.
Thank you. I just want to try to get to this point, if I could, and maybe our panel's not the panel to ask this question, but I'm talking about, now we're talking about a completed system here, and because you're talking, very near term, when members can see 2016 or something of that nature. But you're talking about people being able to contribute a variety of feedstock to produce one fuel source. So we're not talking about one of these winning as a concept. We're talking about each region producing fuel from a feedstock that all goes into an aviation fuel. Is that correct? So that the scalability here is an issue of the I guess I don't want to call it magic, but the scientific process of getting an alcohol-based product out of a variety of different fuel sources.
That's absolutely correct.
And then still being able to supply that on a uniform basis across the United States.
Absolutely correct. And we refer to the concept as something other than a silver bullet, but we refer to it as silver buckshot. And that
Okay.
means, and the buckshot applies to every place locally. As I mentioned, we ourselves are working with some 20 different states, all of whom have different approaches to the process, and it's going extremely well. And we just need a continuation of the programs which USDA has and which DOE has to allow those processes to mature. One thing I'd mention is that, and to just a second what Tom Tadero was telling you, is if you look at the history of food crops like corn, if you look back around 50 years, you'll see a 400% gain in yield per acre. Price is market-driven. Yield is something that we can work on together, and that's what we're doing with USDA.
Well, I think the buckshot analogy is appropriate, and I think to Mr. Plaza and Mr. Tadero's point is that then this becomes a very, very viable rural economic development strategy for the U.S. Because if every region is then providing feed source to an eventual end product, everybody's contributing to the code of the operating system, if you will. And I think that that's very, very positive. I don't know, Ms. Canals, how you're dealing with that in your choices at USDA, but I'm assuming that you are looking to get regional viability.
Yes, ma'am, indeed. Thank you, Senator. And I would say to you, though, as I've been on board now in almost 2.5 years in this role, is that I have been highly promoting geographic diversity in the role of USDA rural development in my agency, and in utilizing the funds that have been made available by the Congress to incite, to be able to incentivize these types of projects. What we're seeing already right now is a complete diversification. Certainly regarding 9003, as I mentioned to you, there's 10 projects that we're looking at individually, and each one is separate, and they're coming from different parts of the country. There were 5 prior to that we've already issued a conditional commitment to, and they too are in different parts of the United States. And then I should also say within our other programs, Rural Energy for America program, that's become completely diverse. And that's notable because that's getting initial momentum at the local level, businesses engaged, the producers engaged, and that's become a true national program.
Mr. Plaza, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think going back to a question a moment ago, the key, I think, for the industry is to focus on the end product being consistent, being molecularly identical to petroleum, or what's called commonly now drop-in fuels. That allows multiple production technologies, multiple feedstocks, and definitely a regional platform. One of the things that we communicate to the Department of Defense as they develop strategies for renewable fuels is, in a long-term purchase commitment, don't pick a technology, pick an ASTM-approved fuel that meets either the emissions under 526, which is an important category, the price, or a number of other important aspects, and allow the producer to develop a platform that provides that. And in our case, we think it's a multitude of platforms, one using the existing lipids that are available now, and then developing additional technologies that would make an equivalent drop-in replacement. As you know, in the Pacific Northwest, we have huge amounts of wood residue that go left unused or have little to no value. That's the type of feedstock that we're developing technologies to access, along with municipal solid waste, agricultural wastes. That works in the Southeast, but maybe it doesn't work in other parts. So there'll be a combination of all of these. The key component is we all make the same product through various technologies.
And so where do we think we are with woody biomass or algae as a source?
Well, I'll speak to woody biomass and maybe let the others speak to algae because they're probably more familiar. I think woody biomass is quickly becoming a very viable feedstock, whether it's 5 years away or 10 is still up in the air. I think it's important that we see more research and development from DOE. We see more support in the funds provided to USDA, who are supportive of woody residues as part of their agricultural process. And we see long-term purchase commitments for these fuels that allow companies like Imperium to invest and in fact, invest more to accelerate the development of that.
Mr. Altman or Ms.?
Let me deal with the algae part for you. We are very supportive of Sapphire. They are a stakeholder member, Helia, a number of different companies. There are two different approaches. One is a process used by a company called Solazyme, which actually uses algae as a catalyst or an enzyme to process fuel that is actually HRJ fuel. And that is commercial, and it's commercial now. The issue with open pond, closed pond systems is to get the cost and economic benefit under control. And typically, there is significant requirement for energy use to extract water from algae. And we are tracking very closely and working very closely with those companies to help make sure that within a period of 5 to 10 years, we're able to get competitive costs from algae.
I would just speak to Sapphire Energy as being one of the projects that we're so keen on because of the fact that it pertains to exactly what we're trying to do here is develop an alternative source for aviation for aviation fuel. And Sapphire is online. What we deal with within my agency really is the financing. And then we work with, of course, NREL and a National Renewable Energy Laboratory, as you're familiar with, to review the capacity, the technology, is this going to work? And so we combine all of that. From our end, it's about trying to get these projects financed and utilization of our loan guarantee program.
And does the ASMT have the capacity to, if you would, bring together such a standard? I mean, obviously, they're involved in the testing and approval of this, but if one element of this is the standardization, are they equipped to guide this next phase, Mr. Altman, in coming up with what that lipid standard or alcohol?
Absolutely. And the thing that has happened in the last 5 years has been ASTM took a process that used to take 10 years to qualify fuel for one process in one factory, and within a period of 3 years, we've been able to qualify both HRJ/HEFA and Fischer-Tropsch period in 3 years. So we've learned how to do this process. The issue that we're dealing with now is we probably have 3 processes running in parallel. So we need, when I mentioned the requirement for research funds, you were kind enough to bring the advanced biofuels effort up to snuff at FAA for the 1 year of funding. But when we look at having to do 3 in parallel, yes, ASTM has the capacity, but it requires that we progress through the FRL levels to make that happen. And it's a much more complex process when you're doing 3 than it is when you're doing 1. But can we do it by 2013, 2015? The answer is yes, we have that capacity.
So they will end up approving 3 different processes, or do you think the standard will
Well, you're asking a very good question because that's what the committee is working on right now, is to establish how many different processes do they actually have to have. I mentioned 3 because one's biological from a synthetic biology process the other is catalytic to get the alcohols, and the third is pyrolysis. So my mind categorizes them that way. Whether the next time that the ASTM committee meets, they'll have 3 processes or 1 process is really up to the technical community to establish that. But I think we have to be prepared to look at multiple pathways at this point and not count, as we did in the past, on having a single pathway like HRJ HEAF or Fischer Tropsch.
If I could add a couple things. First of all, with respect to funding agencies to do the work to develop these new requirements, I think AFRL, the Air Force Research Laboratory, is critical. They do a lot of work with CAFE, with both the civilian and military, with the OEMs. Their funding has been challenged, obviously, with many other areas. But the AFRL group is a really important group out of Wright-Patterson to continue to get funding. I do want to step back and talk about where we are now, though, and point out that there are billions of gallons of lipids available to make this HRJ product that we and others would like to make. So it's important that we recognize there is significant quantities of oilseed crops that exist that we use for biodiesel today that don't interrupt food supply, have great life cycle emissions, tremendously valuable, and priced economically. And to diverge into the previous panel, there is some significant speculation in that market as well. Equally damaging to the ability for biodiesel to be competitive against petroleum and any future biofuels that would use commodity-based index pricing for the feedstock is the speculation that occurs there. So just like petroleum that occurs in grain products, it's much of what drives grain product pricing. So I think the more that we can broaden that commodity speculation concern against all things that folks, because if you kick them out of petroleum, they're going to go into grains, and that's going to cause even a bigger problem.
Well, I've certainly heard from a variety of commodity producers about the concern there. So obviously, we are working very hard to try to convince the CFTC to broaden their efforts. And then just one last question, because I know we're getting close to the noon hour here. And Mr. Pons, could you just give us an idea of what kind of scale we need to have for producing aviation fuel? What level of facility?
Well, it's an interesting point. I think the military's commitment for the U.S. Navy, for example, 366 million gallons of renewable jet fuel by 2016, the U.S. Air Force's commitment, which is quite significant for alternative fuels, which is obviously more than just biofuel. We believe that the appropriate scale and the application we submitted to USDA is for 100 million gallon a year capacity, which puts out about 80 million gallons of renewable jet fuel. The market in the Pacific Northwest is certainly that size. The feedstock is available now from traditional oilseed crops used in biodiesel. It's the appropriate size and scale for where we are today. It certainly doesn't amount to a meaningful amount to displace significant amounts of petroleum, but I think it's a great commercial start to get all of these other strategies and feedstocks to the table. And I think there's opportunity for us to see those replicated 5 to 10 times across the country. And so I think that's the appropriate scale. It can be done smaller, but like with anything, the smaller you go, the more expensive it is on a per gallon basis, the scale.
So you're saying, and I know this is a hard question to answer, just as Mr. Tadero was saying, you know, tell me whether I'm viable or not. And he said, obviously, it depends on what the price of oil is. And we've seen a lot happening in that marketplace. And obviously, we want something that's far more predictable for the future. But you're saying 100 million? Is that what you're saying? Is the
100 million gallon a year scale is an appropriate scale to bring the cost to commercial levels. For example, Defense Logistics Agency just had an RFP out for about 450,000 gallons of a combination of renewable diesel and renewable jet. We submitted a response to that. That was a little bit of a unique idea, but the pricing we put in was for a smaller scale unit, but the prices with today's policy, which is an important component, taking into account the renewable fuel standard, as you heard from Mr. Glover, the long-term extension of biodiesel credit, which applies to renewable jet fuel. Inclusive of those type of policies, we're looking at commercial fuel prices in the $5 to $6 a gallon range, which is still more than petroleum, but for a nascent industry at commercial scale, I think it's significant. And I think we can drastically reduce that with new technologies.
And Mr. Altman, is your association looking at these issues of scalability?
We're obviously very concerned with that, and I would agree with your remarks. I think the important thing is when you get that 100 million gallon facility going, we're looking at a very large opportunity, I think, for the investment community to say, yes, we can do this, and then all of a sudden, potentially oil companies, also other individual investors will spring in, and what's really holding back the industry right now is investment. So to have that 100 million gallon facility, that will be a very important element for us in terms of triggering that next round and significant round of investments, which is what USDA has been trying to achieve.
And this may, again, be a question, maybe not for this panel, but in general, I think the Europeans have a jet fuel SPRO, do they not? So they are basically reserving jet fuel as a way to help build stability. And if we're looking at our current situation here, another way to look at this is just to say, that you're going to produce on an alternative, you're going to produce green jet fuel as a way to even help mitigate price in the future. If we're already doing a SPRO, why not help stabilize prices by having an alternative source that you could be producing?
Let me answer that question because, it's a good question for me to answer because I was part of the SWAFI initiative, which is what the EU was doing. Until a year ago, they had no jet alternative fuel program. They really ran a program to establish if ETS was sufficient to achieve their goals, and quite frankly, it held back their jet fuels program. They now do, and it's really sprung up in 3 different places, in Germany, in France, and in Spain. We had an exhibition at the Paris Air Show. We were privileged to have Secretary Vilsack there, Secretary LaHood, and at that particular show, we had each of those international initiatives come into play, but I can tell you what USDA is doing, what DOE is doing, what FAA is doing are the envy of all the groups in Europe, and they don't really have a process. That's why 80% of the fuel projects around the world in biofuels for aviation come from U.S. companies. It's a great export opportunity for us.
I think we are exporting, so.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, thank you very much to the panel. Appreciate everybody's testimony today. We'll leave the record open. If my colleagues have questions, we hope you'll respond to those and submit those for the record. But thank you for pioneering in this very important area of green aviation fuel. This hearing is adjourned.